Good morning, everyone out there tuning in. Really glad to have you here this morning. Uh, so as we transition to this next panel, we really were excited to be able to form this and present this and share this with you because we feel strongly that as we seek to build a vibrant future for the communities and natural resources of the Hill Country, it's critical that we do so in a way that engages with and reflects the diversity of the region. We really excited. We have an all-star panel here today that will explore why diversity, equity, and inclusion are important for the conservation movement broadly, and also how individuals and organizations can start or continue their journeys to be diverse, equitable, and inclusive. The Hill Country Alliance team and myself are really excited to hear and learn from our panelists alongside all of you today. Now it's my honor to introduce today's moderator, Vanessa Escobar. Vanessa serves as the general manager for the Barton Springs Edwards Aquifer Conservation District and has been with the district since 2013. At the district, she supports the development and implementation of groundwater management policies and provides coordination and oversight over program areas related to regulatory compliance, aquifer science, administration, and education and outreach. She also provides oversight and coordination for the implementation of the district's strategic planning efforts, management plan, groundwater permitting, conservation initiatives, drought management, and policy development. She does a whole heck of a lot there. Prior to joining the district, Vanessa worked for the Texas Water Development Board and the city of Irving. She's a native of Katy, Texas, a Texas A&M grad, and we're really proud to have her serving on the Hill Country Alliance board. With that, I'd like to turn things over to Vanessa to introduce the panel and kickstart our conversation. Thanks so much, Vanessa.
All right. Thanks, John. Well, thanks for that thorough intro. I wanted to say good morning to the panelists and the guests in the audience, and welcome and thank you for everyone who's taken this next hour to tune into this topic. Again, my name is Vanessa Escobar and member of the Hill Country Alliance Board. I'm glad you've chosen to spend this next hour with us because I think you're in store for a really insightful and relevant and maybe even personal discussion today as we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice in the Hill Country kind of conservation scene and environment and discuss why it matters. The audience members can also participate by using the Q&A feature and sending your questions along, and we'll make sure that we save some time to share some of those questions with our panelists. So please feel free to do that throughout. So as we kick it off and dive into this conversation, I think it's actually appropriate to acknowledge that right now we're all living in a world where these very real life stories are playing out right in front of us on a national scale. And these stories are very deeply centered around these values and concepts of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And I know it has a lot of us and a lot of leaders of these organizations and of our communities thinking about this and reflecting on our own efforts to promote these values within our organizational missions, within our workplaces, just within our personal circle. So I think in that process of reflection, some of us are possibly finding that there's probably still a lot of work to do in some of these areas. And I know others are probably thinking, well, yes, of course, I support many of those things, many of those values. I believe they're important, but what can I do? So for today, that's what we want to do. We want to create that space where we can have that conversation and hear from these leaders that you see in front of us on the panel and really talk to them about those values and what each one of us can do. So without further ado, I want to go ahead and introduce our panelists. And I'd like to ask each one of our guest panelists to briefly introduce yourself, tell us what organization you're with and what your role is there. And I'll go ahead and start with Sapna.
All right, thank you everyone for joining this panel today. I'm really excited to have this conversation. So my name is Sapna Mulki, and I'm an independent consultant where I work with public, private, and nonprofit water institutions to do two things. One is to create diverse, inclusive, and equitable workforces. And the second thing is to promote justice and equity in our water projects. I've worked in Texas Water for over 7 years. Diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice is at the center of everything that I do. Among other things, I conduct DEI training workshops. I also help organizations operationalize and embed equity and justice into their policies, practices, and programs. I'm also the co-host of Breaking Green Ceilings, a podcast that amplifies the voices of environmentalists from historically underrepresented communities, including people with disabilities, queer, trans, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. I've also interviewed some fellow water nerds, so check it out. It's called Breaking Green Ceilings, and thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Sapna. I'd like to turn it over to David, please.
Good morning. My name is David Buggs. I'm the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer for Texas Parks and Wildlife. I've been there 6 years now. It's been an exciting time. I helped develop the strategy for diversity, inclusion, and equity for Texas Parks and Wildlife. Also am the chair of a organization called MNRIC, which is Minorities in Natural Resource Conservation. It's based out of the Southeast. I also sit on a managing board for something that many of you may have never heard of. It's called the Diversity Joint Venture in Conservation, based out of Washington, D.C. It's a compilation of state, federal, NGO, and universities that are focused on conservation and focus on creating more employment for women and people of color in conservation. And I also co-chair the Diversity Inclusion Committee for AFRA, which is the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. So the things that we're talking about now is not just something that is important to Hill Country Alliance and those that are in this area, but it's a nationwide issue and something that I think is very important for us to discuss.
Thank you, David. Sounds like you're doing a lot of great things. And let's see, Emily, would you please introduce yourself?
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm Emily Warren Armitano. I work at the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation as a program officer. I'm focused on water grant making and land grant making. And a lot of our grantees work in the Texas Hill Country. And I'm also very, very slow PhD student, and the focus of my research is on the barriers and opportunities that people of color who have people of color who've decided to enter into the conservation or environmental field and their opportunities or barriers to advance. Sorry, that was a mouthful.
Thank you, Emily. And I don't think there's any such thing as slow. I've known a lot of people to take their time with the PhD. And then last but not least, can we have Rocío Villalobos?
Hi, I'm Rocío Villalobos. I work at the City of Austin's Equity Office as the Immigrant Affairs Coordinator. And I usually like to ground my introduction in a sense of place, just because I feel like where I've grown up has shaped so much of who I am and the things that I've gotten involved with. So I've come to think about my experience as being shaped ultimately by two borders. One is the US-Mexico border that disrupted my family's ancestral migration route, but also currently separates my family, as well as the I-35 highway as a border between West Austin and East Austin, and the sort of legacy that exists around institutional racism and segregation in the creation of this city. And those experiences ultimately shaped me as a person and my efforts and work to get involved in doing racial equity work.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Rocío. So as we move into this conversation, I want to go ahead and share one slide that the panel put together. And I'm not sure, can folks actually see the slide? maybe nobody can see the slide yet?
No.
Okay, let me try one more time. What we've done is we've put together a slide of terms and definitions for some of the things we're actually discussing today. And while everyone might feel like you already know what those items mean, what these topics are all about, I think in today's context, that has evolved a little bit. And really, we're taking a very intentional look at trying to analyze what this means to us in our lives, in our workplaces, and in our communities again. So I'd like to turn to some of our panelists to better understand what we mean by the terms we see up here. And I'll start with Rocío and ask if you can share with us what these terms and concepts mean to your office team and why you all focus particularly on the racial equity component.
Sure. These are all a part of our work and the things that we do. Our office is explicitly rooted in racial equity. And this is because race continues to be the primary predictor of quality of life outcomes. So whether you're looking at issues of education, housing, access to clean air, life expectancy, maternal mortality, and as we're seeing now, rates of death and infection for COVID, race continues to be that primary predictor of somebody's quality of life outcomes. There's a 10-year difference in life expectancy between West Austin and East Austin due to the city's legacy of segregation and racism, much like many other cities, right? So Austin isn't as progressive or unique as it believes itself to be in that regard. And you know, a lot of people that we talk to as an office, since we work with city departments, but also community organizations and people that are interested in doing this work but don't really know where to begin. We ground our work in the history of Austin to help people understand how we got here and to help people understand that it's going to take time and deliberate action to change the outcomes that we currently have. So people can have the best intentions in the world but still produce racist outcomes in their work, which is why we prioritize helping people develop a racial equity framework that can guide their efforts. And the way that we talk about it is, you know, racial equity isn't a zero-sum game, where when you center and prioritize the people who have been most negatively impacted by our systems and institutions and increase their safety and well-being, everybody benefits. So it's good for all of us to support folks that are the most marginalized at this moment.
Mm-hmm. And I agree. I think, you know, without knowing it, probably a lot of us are susceptible to some of these implicit biases. And like you said, we're unintentionally creating these systems or these situations and these outcomes. And I think it does require us to dive into these a little bit of a further analysis on these topics. So thank you for that. And Sapna, I'd like to ask you, what do these terms and concepts mean to you in your line of work as you particularly focus in the water industry and also focus particularly on inclusion and equity?
Sure. So within my work specifically, we often use the following quote from Verna Myers to describe diversity and inclusion. And it goes, diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance. And I think that this is quite a straightforward translation where diversity is about representation and inclusion is about involvement. And it's a great starting point in many of my conversations to begin this discussion around diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. But I would also like to amend this statement to say that diversity is going to a party and inclusion is being a member of the party planning committee. So in a sense, this is what we should be working towards. You should feel safe to bring your authentic self to any party or organization in this case, and be celebrated no matter who you are. And inclusion is where you feel like you too can be a member of the planning part or the party planning committee and included regardless of your race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, socioeconomic status, the list goes on. So in my work, I define equity as creating systems that shift power from the privileged to folks who have been minoritized or historically marginalized. So that includes people with disabilities, queer, trans, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And I feel that with diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice values in the environmental and conservation community, it's important because we're better when we're working together. We need to ensure that all people have access to clean air and water, safe communities, easy and equitable access to nature, and protection from the ravages of climate change. So these basic needs, equally necessary and urgent for all people, which is really foundational to bringing the conservation movement and ethos into the 21st century. And the other reason why I think that diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice is important is because the world continues to change. And either we get with the times or we get left behind. So as we approach 2042, there's a turning point where over 50% of the people in the US will be people of color. And it becomes increasingly critical that we address the diversity crisis at the heart of all of our environmental movements. It's not just in the Hill Country, as David mentioned. So it's really up to our community on how relevant we want to be in this crisis. And I just want to point out that because relevance is so important, we're seeing that the environmental justice movement is really increasing in momentum because it represents the interests of the marginalized communities. So that's really how in diversity, equity, and inclusion is really defined in the work that I do.
Well, thank you for that. And I agree that having to decide and reflect on what level of relevance folks want to maintain could sometimes be a tough and uncomfortable conversation as well, just to take the time and start talking about these things that sometimes can be contentious. So I'd like to maybe pause for a second and see if we can bring up a poll with the audience just to kind of take a temperature and just see where folks in the audience find themselves invested on these topics of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice at this moment. There's a few options here, and I'll just read through them really quickly. I'm invested in learning about US history with the respect to race and how it affects people today. I'm reevaluating and addressing exclusionary systems. I'm intentionally actively implementing these JEDI practices. And I want to do something, but I just don't know what to do. And then the last option is, this is not a priority for me. And while folks take the time, maybe a few seconds, we'll give a minute or so for folks to respond. You know, I know personally, I find myself probably in that fourth category where, you know, I want to do something, but I don't know what to do. And I know even on a personal individual level at home, we've been having this conversation, my husband and I, about our girls in particular, because we both grew up, as Rocío described in her situation, being very influenced by the demographics and the communities that we came from. And we were part of those underrepresented communities. And it really has shaped who we are and how hard we've worked and our path forward. And ultimately, we've created a different life for our children. But in doing so, we have kind of unintentionally removed some of the diversity from their life. And so it has us reflecting, what can we do personally? So let's see, I'm interested to see what the audience has responded to. Have we gotten enough poll responses? Interesting. So it's a relatively almost equal breakout, with the most respondents in the category of I'm reevaluating and addressing exclusionary systems, which I think is probably pretty accurate, given how elevated the conversation has become maybe in the last couple years. Are there any initial thoughts from some of the panelists on these results?
I must say I'm pleasantly surprised to see that 15 people are invested in learning about US history with respect to race.
Yeah, that is interesting to see. Well, thank you folks for participating. Those things are always kind of fun to see. So now I'd like to see us talk about, why do we think this these things should matter to folks in the audience, and why is it important for our panelists in your line of work? So I'd like to turn it over to David and ask about Texas Parks and Wildlife, and why does your organization feel that cultivating diversity, equitable and inclusive workspaces is critical to your mission? And what does that look like through the lens of conservation in particular?
Well, again, thank you for having me this afternoon. Well, it's not afternoon quite, but it's getting close. One of the things that I recognized early on when I first got into this is people had an understanding of diversity and inclusion and what it was all about. The big thing was going back to what you just said, the why for me, and the why for different folks is different. I think sometimes we want to paint a broad brush on the why, but you have to develop your own why. Otherwise, you won't get the work done. It'll just be a check the box for you. So one of the things I encourage everybody to do is really sit back and think about why this is important, not only for you personally, but for your organization. But just some of the things that we focused on at Texas Parks and Wildlife, and it was shared earlier, is first of all, the issue of relevance. Being relevant to the changing population, not becoming isolated from a growing society. Texas has been a majority-minority state since 2003, and it continues to grow. And one of the things that we've also recognized is Texas is a majority privately owned state, and there's a lot of landowners across the state. I think it's almost 95% privately owned. A lot of those are absentee landowners. So we've got to make sure that everybody cares about the land, the society that we live in, or it's going to come back and hunt all of us. We've got to make sure that everybody is involved, that everybody has an appreciation. But if you don't feel like you're a part of developing what it takes to manage those lands, to maintain and sustain those lands, you're not going to be involved. And it's not only going to affect the protection of the land, it's going to affect sustainability, it's going to affect the innovation which comes with diversity. It's also going to affect something that I heard a little earlier, political support and public support, which is when you talk about public land, it is heavily needed. If you don't have that political support and that public support for funding, especially for organizations like ours, it's just not going to have an impact. So we've got to make sure, and this is something that we're focused on, is how do we educate the public? How do we engage the public? Also, how do we bring in more people that look like the public so that they can go out and educate and relate to those folks? Because another big drawback that I have is the fact that we want to reach out to all these different audiences, and there's nobody inside of the agency that looks like those audiences. Well, how can we even relate? We talk about how we want to be better at doing X, Y, and Z and making sure that everybody feels included, but you start off from a place of exclusion. So we've got to start focusing on how we bring folks into this space, how we create opportunities for education for folks. It starts with junior high and high school, engaging in colleges and universities, and that's something that we're doing a much better job at Texas Parks and Wildlife. Just an example, we had a big push to start recruiting more diversity. And I actually went in and helped our HR department adjust our recruitment strategy and made it real inclusive, where we're reaching out to different universities, creating mentoring programs and so on and so forth. But the focus was still around, well, how do we find full-grown apples and oranges? Well, my thing was, if you can't find full-grown apples and oranges, you need to grow some trees. Mm-hmm. What we started doing was actually going to different universities and saying, let's look at your current environmental engagement program, and let's see if there are some opportunities for us to bring in some new people, to bring in some educators, bring in some of our current partners to give you real life applications, to get you some curriculum. So once you graduate, you're prepared to go into organizations like Texas Parks and Wildlife or Wildlife Society or whatever the organization is. Because if we're not doing the job of actually getting folks prepared to go and function well in these organizations, we're just spitting in the wind. So the first thing that we did was start putting programs together to prepare folks to start working in those organizations. The next thing that we did, we actually set goals within our organizations. Each division has diversity and inclusion goals. Now, that doesn't mean that we're saying you've got to have 5 people that look like this, 5 people look like that. Our goals are set so that we're doing those things that make sure not only if those 5 people come in that they stay. So there's a focus around the recruitment piece, there's a focus around the retention piece and outreach and education. So you've got to have all those included in each department within Texas Parks and Wildlife has those 3 things that are incorporated into their goals. We call them pillars. The other thing that we're doing, we're in the process of developing now, is what we call an urban outreach advisory committee. Because if you're not listening to the public that you're trying to serve, at least you say you're going to serve, you're going to create something that they won't participate in. There was a gentleman that worked for us a while back by the name of Ernie Gambich that made a statement. I thought it was fantastic. He says, if you've got all of these different things, this wildlife, this natural resource, but nobody's interested, you haven't heard the voices of the folks, they're not going to take time to participate in voting for it. They're not going to put funds behind it, and they're not going to push politicians to put funds behind it. So that's another reason why we're creating this advisory committee, so that we can hear the voices of the people that are actually engaged in doing some of the work or have some type of interest in the communities that we want to help do the work. The other thing that we're working on right now, and I'm glad I'm on this panel, is how do we get conservation agencies and environmental justice agencies in the same room and collaborating. And that's huge. If we don't do that, we're both going to have failing efforts. I know we look at each other like Democrats and Republicans look at each other right now, but there's a third space that we all want. We all want clean air. We all want clean water. We all want safe environments. Let's get in the room and talk about how we can put our funds together, our support together, and make a move with that and get everybody on board. And then there's some things that everybody gets that they really want, but we've got to have those conversations. So those are the things that we're working on, a few of the things that we're working on at Texas Parks and Wildlife. And we're also trying to develop a process that we can share nationwide, because we recognize we can't do this in a vacuum. Texas may end up being successful at some things, but if other state agencies and NGOs outside of Texas aren't being successful, eventually we're going to all lose. So that's what we're focused on right now. And I will stop because I can.
I know we could probably talk about this for 2 hours, but that's wonderful to hear a lot of the work that Parks and Wildlife team is focusing on. And I think the organization is going down the right track of kind of broadening and partnering across the nation to not reinvent the wheel and to borrow good ideas. So thank you for that, David. Let's turn to Emily. As a conservation funder, why do you feel that diversity, equity, inclusion are critical in the successes of these organizations that you work with and partner with?
So I think it's important for us to kind of start with a progression of thought. So if you believe that every person, regardless of their personal circumstance, should be treated with respect, then DEI should matter to you. And if you believe that all Texans or all Hill Country residents deserve to have access to parks and open spaces and clean water, and that no one community should bear the negative burden of environmental impacts like flooding or drought more than others, and that everyone should have economic opportunities to build a meaningful life of their choosing, then DEI should matter to you. And so if this is the case, I think that we have to start by acknowledging that, excuse me, historic, systemic, and institutional barriers, particularly racial bias and discrimination, play a huge role in the deep environmental and economic disparities in the Texas Hill Country and in Texas and in the United States. So over the last several years, many of our partner foundations across the country and in Texas have recognized, and some more than others, that their missions, whether it's sustainability or climate or improving the environment in general, it can't be achieved without also addressing these social and racial justice issues. And this is also true of a lot of the organizations that the Mitchell Foundation supports. So this has also caused these foundations to proactively identify those inequities and question their own funding strategies and begin to address those inequities. So for example, I would point to the Houston Endowment as a good example. So I guess I just want to echo something that David said earlier, that I would really flip the question and ask, how do you think your organization could possibly be successful in your project or mission if you don't think that DEI is critical? So
it's a great way to question to pose to folks. Thank you, Emily. So, Rocío, I'd like to turn to you and talk about your perspective at the City of Austin. And we know that you spent much of your professional and volunteer life being dedicated to the social justice issues. How have you seen inequity in the environmental outdoor spaces, and what are the critical impacts that we need to address there?
I've seen it on multiple fronts. In the part of East Austin that I grew up in, we mainly went to green spaces that we could get to by foot or bus. Since my dad worked multiple jobs and was the only one of my parents who could drive. And at the time, there were fewer parks that were accessible to us, and the ones that we could get to by foot weren't in the best condition, or they were over-policed. Givens Park in East Austin was the one that we mainly went to, and that's a park that is still heavily policed to this day. So when we're thinking about access to green spaces, it's not just a question of, are there any? It's also a question of, if people attempt to enjoy these green spaces, what happens to them, right? And I think over the past year, we've seen multiple instances from Christian Cooper, right, in New York, bird watching, having the police called on him because he looked suspicious. I think that's one area that we need to think about. When people of color do try to enjoy these spaces, what is the reception that we receive? You know, do we feel welcome or not in that regard? Do we feel safe, right? Do we have a right to feel safe? In another front that was mentioned before as well, you know, I grew up by the oil tank farms that were once located at the corner of Airport and Springdale, which now has a nice modern building. It's home to organizations like the Austin Parks Foundation, alongside a coffee shop and a yoga studio. But when I walked by that oil tank farm as a kid, I didn't realize that that place was poisoning and killing people in my community. To me, it was just a part of the landscape. You know, I didn't understand that these oil tank farms were there because of decisions that the city made about who they would invest in and whose lives were expendable and worth endangering, and who was worth protecting by that regard. So to the point that both David and Emily made before, when we're thinking about issues that some of the organizations here are working on. So for example, I know that pipelines have been a big issue, and there have been efforts to keep pipelines out of the Hill Country. Are you also fighting for making sure that other communities don't end up with a pipeline? Communities that have less access to resources and power to be able to influence those types of decisions, are you also doing that work in solidarity with those communities? So when we're thinking about these issues, we have to think about the bigger picture and outside of our immediate environment, right? Who else is going to be impacted by these things, and what can we do so that we are working together in solidarity with other folks that are doing this work. And you know, when we're thinking too about issues of retention at organizations, again, if organizations aren't utilizing that racial equity framework in their work, sure, you may be able to end up attracting a few diverse candidates here and there, but are you able to retain them? Are those folks able to feel like they have found an organization where they want to stay, a place where they can make a meaningful impact? Or will they eventually end up leaving the organization? Kind of to the speaking to the research that I think Emily is doing for her PhD. So all of these things are connected, and we have to think about how we're working across issues and not just within our silos, and working to, in many ways, build power and share power with folks that haven't had access to decision-making entities before.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Rocío, I think you bring up some very excellent remarks and points there, particularly, you know, when you were discussing the pipeline issues that are affecting a lot of Texans and through the Hill Country in particular. You know, the question about that you put out there, are we thinking about where it's going to be going, being rerouted, and who it's going to affect? And you know, I don't think we are giving great thought to that. And that's a tough, you know, question to ask ourselves, and a tough response to have to give. And so I think that's why these conversations are so critical, because it forces these tough questions, and it forces us to think further beyond about our decisions and our actions. So thank you for that. Sapna, I'd like to ask you again about your focus, with your focus being specifically in the water industry. Why is diversity and equity and inclusion important for both public and private actors in that space?
Sure. And I'd also like to point out that diversity, equity, and inclusion is just important throughout all sectors, regardless of the water industry. But speaking to my work in particular, it's diversity, equity, and inclusion is important for three main reasons. The first is that in the water industry, the workforce of about 1.7 million, almost a third of all water professionals will be eligible for retirement in just 10 years. So who are we going to replace them with? We're talking about hiring for diversity and inclusion in the water industry, but that means nothing if we can't create inclusive and equitable workplaces where people feel like they belong. And retaining that diverse talent is guaranteed when organizations are have inclusive and equitable systems. The second reason why diversity, equity, and inclusion is important for the water industry is because America's water crisis goes far beyond Flint. It is also reflective of the bias that our industry has towards low-income and communities of color when it comes to providing water services. Other Flints can be found all over the country. For example, contaminated water as a result of uranium mining in Navajo Nation, lead in the water in Newark, New Jersey, and the list goes on. Additionally, 2 million people don't have access to clean drinking water and sanitation in this country, and most of the people who don't are Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color. So, all of this is happening because of the biases and stereotypes that we hold towards poor and communities of color in the water industry, and we don't even know it for the most part. So I want to change that through my work on diversity, equity, and inclusion awareness. The third reason why diversity, equity, and inclusion is important for the water industry is that water solutions need to be representative of the communities we serve in. In the case of Texas, like David mentioned, Texas is a majority minority state where 55% is non-Hispanic white. So, it begs the question of why don't our organizations, companies, our politics, and even our friendship circles reflect this? I often hear people saying, but yeah, you know, it's most of our community is white folks, or there's, you know, there isn't diversity. And to that, I say that there's definitely diversity. You're just not looking hard enough, or you're not making it a priority to include those marginalized folks in your community. I'm sure that they are there. There are, you know, women who are marginalized. There are queer, trans, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and people with disabilities who are marginalized. So if you make it a priority to make sure that they're seen, heard, and included within these organizations or even processes, projects, I think it's there. We just have to make the effort. And, you know, at the end of the day, if we function with the mantra of we are better and stronger when we're together, I really believe that that is what can really promote the diversity, equity, and inclusion in the water industry and beyond.
Thank you, Sapna. So
Vanessa, you mind if I just share something?
Yes, please.
When you start talking about DE&I, Sapna said it very well. It's an intentional process. It's not something that's just going to happen just because you think it's the right thing to do. You got to be intentional. You got to be intentional about, for instance, some of the folks that may be looking on that have boards. You got to be intentional about being inclusive on your boards. That's something that you can do. You can actually reach out to folks and say, hey, look, I would love to hear your opinion or your community's opinion on your board. If there are policies, you've got to be intentional about changing some of your policies so that they aren't exclusionary. If it comes to how you're going to engage brand new projects, you got to be intentional about going out and talking to the community about what to do. One of the things that I've learned is we have a tendency to develop a whole lot of things and just believe it's okay for everybody when you haven't gotten everybody's opinion. So I want to stress that the intentionality of doing this is the only way that we're going to solve this. Otherwise, in 10 years, we'll be having the same conversation.
Yes, thank you. So I just wanted to point out that we're coming up on the last 10 minutes here, and we are getting some really good questions from the audience. So I'd like to work through some of those with Leah and also have our panelists kind of help us wrap up some of the discussion with the focus on some specific, like 1 or 2 meaningful steps folks can take. Where's that low-hanging fruit? You know, how can we in particular focus on the hill country conservation area with these meaningful actions? And I'll ask Leah if you can help me identify a few key questions that we can maybe focus in on from the audience.
Yeah, we've gotten some really awesome questions. So if we don't pick your question, I'm apologizing now in advance. Thank you for submitting them, and we'll try to get back to folks afterwards. I think the first question really ties into the hill country. I'd like to ask one that's been echoed by a couple folks, but how does the concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion, how does this all play into the narrative we have of maintaining the Texas hill country in terms of preserving our heritage, our natural beauty, and these unique features that are found here?
Thanks. Well, I'll open that up to anyone on the panel who would like to chime in on that great question.
I think one thing that comes to mind for me, and it ties into, you know, how do you also recruit or involve communities of color to enjoy, visit, you know, get involved with conservation efforts in the hill country. I think we also have to think about the stories that we're telling about the land, right? Are we glorifying only settler colonialism in the stories that we tell? Are we recognizing the Native and Indigenous peoples who were here and who were the original stewards of the land? I think that goes a long way as far as communicating the level of work and thinking and intentionality that has gone into how we engage with community and what types of relationships we're interested in building with community. So I think working to tell a more expansive, a more inclusive, history of the land is an important part of that for me.
Mhm.
Can I add something to that?
Yes, please do.
So I think, and this has always kind of struck me here in Texas, is that language and how we choose to describe our heritage and preserving our heritage and culture, as Rocío was saying, is inherently exclusionary. And so it doesn't honor the fact that the hill country is changing and it's going to change. And like it's kind of ignoring the urban centers, it's ignoring all of the history. And so, you know, I think like being mindful of even the language and how you describe what it means to have, what is the hill country and what it means for all Texans, as opposed to maybe your slice of the pie or maybe your family's story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that really ties into this follow-up question. What activity is going on currently to research, celebrate, share the heritage of other communities in the Hill Country who have been historically underrepresented in these stories?
And I concur with everything that everybody's just said. And when you were reading that question and you said the word heritage, all kind of sirens went off in my head, because usually it's just one side of the story, and it's a small piece of the story. When you start looking at the history of Texas and how this land was settled, there were people from all backgrounds that were a part of settling this land. When you start even looking at, and one of the things I educated some folks on the other day, when you start looking at some of the state parks in Texas, they were not all built by a bunch of white guys. There were African Americans that did it. There were Hispanics that did it. There were Native Americans involved. There were women involved. And we have a tendency to just tell one side of the story and call it our heritage. Well, no, that's your heritage. But we need to tell the entire story. And that will also help us understand why some people don't want to participate if you tell the entire story. So we need to be mindful, and Emily said it earlier, we need to be mindful of the language we use when we start talking about sustaining this area that we're focused on.
Those are great points. Great points. Leah, do you think there's any more questions?
Yeah, actually, there's a bunch more, but one that I think is really pressing given our audience. We see a big urban-rural divide. That is a subject you could do a whole panel on. But are there differences that we can explore in implementing or thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in urban versus rural areas?
Well, it's something that I'll just share that I touched on a little bit earlier. When you start talking about urban and rural areas, we still all want the same thing. We want clean air, we want clean water, we want safe, clean land. There are a lot of places where we can do a lot of collaboration. It takes funds to do some of those things, but it also takes us stepping outside of our comfort zone and not pointing fingers and says, yeah, but they. We need to talk about what we want, but we've got to start having that conversation. We need to be, again, intentional about creating the dialogue so we can move the needle. There are a lot of things that we could really do together, but we need to stop pointing at those things that we don't like about each other and move and get in that third space.
Yeah, and to add on to what David said, I think we need to be asking ourselves, you know, not just why are we preserving, trying to protect these spaces, these lands, but who we're doing it for. And I know that there's a large demographic of this state who utilize these open spaces and these park systems because that's all they have the means to do. And so there's probably a lot of opportunity there to push that, advance those missions a little bit more if we do include those community perspectives and those individual perspectives.
I'd like to add to what David was saying in terms of we all just want the same thing at the end of the day. And I think it's just fundamental that we see ourselves not as urban or rural, just see that we are human beings who have needs, who want to be seen, heard, and respected for who we are. So that's that's just something that I feel we need to divorce ourselves from, these identities and these stereotypes that we've created about groups of people just based on what they look like. And that's when you start to like give more meaning to these false differences of urban, rural, black, white, brown. You know, that's really working against us at the end of the day.
One of the things that I always share with groups is when we start talking about urban versus rural and EJ versus conservation, we're actually in violent agreement with each other. We just need to stop listening to our own tapes and start listening to somebody and just kind of help educate each other so that we find that third space and have those conversations. I think we can do a lot, but we keep shooting ourselves in the foot, so to speak. So we've got to start having those conversations and be willing to listen.
Mm-hmm.
One
Perhaps
more question. Oh wait, Emily, were you gonna respond? Okay.
Oh, you're on mute. Mm-hmm.
I was just going to say, you know, it kind of goes back to language as well. I think that we shouldn't be so naive to not think that the word and the term rural versus urban isn't coded language that signifies a value structure that, you know, whoever is in charge of the dominant narrative of what it means to be a rural Texan is versus an urban Texan. And I think that breaking down and being mindful, I think, you know, kind of going back to this idea of how powerful language is and how you describe yourself and checking your own biases that you probably don't even think about because, I mean, you're a well-intentioned person and you come from a rural background and you've got this identity. But I think that for people who aren't in that club, it's exclusionary and it carries a whole lot of meaning behind it. So
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. That's a really good point.
I've got one last question, and take this as like a practical question. For the conservation organizations in this audience who don't maybe know quite where to start, what should step one be for them? And who should they talk to? What should they do to start implementing these practices in their own workplaces?
So if I can take that, the first thing I recommend that organizations do is to begin an audit to identify the biases in the DNA of your organization, in the fabric of it. Identify the biases in your processes and your systems. And essentially an audit is using the insights from the fields of psychology and behavioral economics to help your organizations take bias as much as possible out of risk decisions that you make. The second thing I recommend is to commit to an intentional, meaningful, and accountable set of goals to achieve diversity, equity, and inclusion and justice within your organization. So for example, you know, by 2022, we will have a board that's 50% female and 50% people of color, or by 2021, we're going to be having we'll have equitable hiring processes. And the third recommendation is that individuals make a significant part of whether an organization is going to be successful or not in its DEI journey. And so I emphasize that senior leadership plays a critical role in ensuring that there is accountability to those DEI goals and ensuring that they're met over the short and long term.
And
I want to add
go
to
ahead.
that,
Yeah,
if
go
you
ahead.
don't mind, because I think that there's some easy things that people can do just as on an individual level. Part of it is do your homework. It took a long time for us to get to where we are right now. And you need to take the time and be in the uncomfortable space of learning how we got here. And then also recognizing that you or your organization has power to influence others and do good. So like, don't let this idea that you don't want to offend anybody or you don't know what to do or that it's a hard conversation. I hear that this is a hard conversation again. Imagine people of color who live in this in their skin every single day. It's uncomfortable for you, not for anybody else. And to not let all of that keep you from doing anything, which is kind of where we've been, I feel, for the last at least 50 years. And kind of to Sapna's point and David's about intentionality, I think that building into all of your practices, whether it's a process or a meeting or a decision point or research project or whatever, have some checkpoints along the way where you stop and you ask yourself the question, am I approaching this equitably? What are the ramifications of this decision? Is this inclusive? So.
Yes, these are all great points. And I'll just add here as we kind of close out the hour, that as we all work towards understanding how to create, maintain, and cultivate more inclusive cultures, more diverse cultures in whatever we do in our workplaces, our communities, our organizational missions, I think we just need to take a little step back from focusing only on what these organizations can do for others, but also take a closer look within ourselves and look, like everyone has said here today, do it from the inside out. Start on an individual level first and take those small steps. And then if all of us are doing a little bit more of that, we will get there and make progress. So please, I'm very glad that we were able to have everyone join us. I wish we could have 2 hours, but I wanted to say thank you to the panel for your time today, and thank you to the Hill Country Alliance staff for helping to host and organize this and filter through the questions. I think that wraps it up for today for this panel.